This story is a work of fiction created for entertainment purposes only. It does not depict real people events or official military actions. I remember the sound first. My shoes against the cold stone floor of Norfolk Circuit Court, October 2024, each step echoing louder than it should have, like the building itself was paying attention. The marble was polished to a dull shine, and it reflected my uniform just enough for me to catch the edge of my own reflection. Navy blue. Dress blues. Pressed the night before. The fabric sat heavy on my shoulders, not because of the medals or the history stitched into it, but because of why I was there wearing it. The bruise on my left cheek was still visible, faded from deep purple into a sick yellow-green, the kind of color makeup can soften but never erase. It did not come from training or deployment. It came from a kitchen I once called home. As I crossed the threshold, the room tightened. Not silence exactly, more like a collective pause, as if everyone inhaled at once and forgot to breathe. My parents were already seated in the front row. My father leaned back with his arms folded, jaw set, lips curved in that familiar expression I learned to read as a child. Not anger, ownership. The look that said, "You are here because I allowed it." My mother sat beside him, posture-perfect eyes sliding past me like I was an inconvenience rather than a daughter. When she noticed the bruise, her gaze flicked away. No shock, no concern. Just irritation, as if I had brought something messy into a room that demanded appearances. My father saw it too. His mouth twitched upward just slightly. A sneer. The same one he wore when I enlisted at 18, when he told anyone who would listen that the military was for people who could not succeed anywhere else. I kept walking. I did not rush. I did not slow. 12 years of service teaches you that pace is control. I took my seat alone at the defense table. No lawyer beside me. I could feel the whispers ripple behind my back. People assumed the uniform was a performance, a last attempt at sympathy. They thought the bruise made me weak. They thought I was there to explain myself. They were wrong. The judge had not entered yet, but the power in the room was already shifting. I could feel it in the way a bailiff straightened when he noticed the ribbons on my chest, in the way a man 2 rows back stopped whispering mid-sentence. My father leaned toward my mother and muttered something under his breath. Confident, comfortable, certain I would finally be put in my place. He had no idea that the documents in my folder, the evidence I carried, and the silence I had learned to master were about to strip him of the only thing he ever truly valued: control. They thought the uniform was a costume. The judge did not. I did not become who I am because anyone believed in me early. I became her because no one did. I enlisted at 18, the summer after I graduated high school in Chesapeake, Virginia, with a duffel bag that still smelled like my childhood bedroom and a certainty that staying would cost me more than leaving ever could. My father called it running. My mother called it a phase. I called it oxygen. I did not grow up dreaming about uniforms or glory. I grew up counting silence, learning how to read rooms before entering them, learning that approval in my house was rationed and conditional. The military did not feel like escape. It felt like structure, and structure was the first thing that ever made sense to me. Boot camp stripped everything down fast. Hair excuses softness. I learned early that volume did not equal strength. The loudest people burned out first. The ones who lasted were the ones who listened, who followed instructions exactly, who understood that discipline was not about dominance but about trust. I was not the fastest. I was not the strongest. I was steady. That mattered more than anyone explained at the time. I moved into naval support operations tied to special warfare units, not because I wanted proximity to danger, but because I tested well under pressure and did not panic when things went wrong. SEAL support is not the part people write books about. It is logistics planning, intelligence coordination, transport, preparation, and aftermath. It is being the reason a mission succeeds without your name ever appearing in a headline. I learned to operate in the background, to anticipate needs before they were spoken, to prepare contingencies quietly. That fit me. Over 12 years, I rotated through assignments that took me from Virginia Beach to overseas staging areas that never made the news. I learned how to sleep anywhere, eat when food appeared, and hold information without letting it leak into expression. My evaluations were consistent, calm under stress, reliable, not attention-seeking. That last line followed me everywhere. I took it as a compliment. I did not talk about my work at home. Not because it was classified, but because it would not have mattered. My father waved it off whenever it came up, telling relatives I worked a desk job for men who did real fighting. My mother smiled and changed the subject. Over time, I stopped mentioning it. In the military, I learned that you do not perform for people who already decided how they will see you. Somewhere around my 7th year, during a joint training exercise stateside, I was injured. Not in combat, not heroically. A transport vehicle mishandled a turn during a night movement drill. I was thrown sideways hard enough to fracture my knee and damage connective tissue that never healed quite right. It ended my eligibility for certain roles and eventually led to medical limitations. I remember lying on the ground afterwards, staring up at a sky without stars, more angry at the inconvenience than the pain. Recovery took months. Physical therapy became routine. I learned patience the hard way. The injury did not break me, but it slowed me down, and slowing down taught me something important. Identity that relies on speed shatters when speed is taken away. Identity built on discipline adapts. I stayed in service in adjusted capacities, training coordination, planning support, mentoring younger personnel who still thought being loud meant being capable. I never corrected them. Time would do that for me. When I medically retired after 12 years, I did not throw a party. I folded my uniforms carefully. I kept my routine: early mornings, physical maintenance, quiet. People assume leaving the military creates a void. For me, it created space. Space to breathe without waiting for permission. Space to exist without proving anything. My personality did not soften when I left. It clarified. I am not warm on first meeting. I am polite, controlled, observant. I do not overshare. I do not decorate my history. The work taught me that credibility dissolves when you chase validation. At home, that trait was misread as arrogance. In reality, it was survival refined into habit. I paid my bills on time. I kept my commitments. I maintained my grandfather's property quietly for years without announcing it. Taxes, repairs, insurance. I did not tell my parents because experience taught me they would only hear what served them. I lived alone. I kept my circle small. I slept well most nights. Nightmares still came occasionally, not violent ones, just echoes of responsibility. The sense that if something failed, it would be because I missed a detail. Those fade slower than injuries. Through all of it, I never once used my service as leverage. I did not ask for respect. I assumed respect was something you earned through consistency, not performance. That belief would matter later when standing in court bruised and alone forced me to choose between defending my worth loudly or letting evidence speak in the only language power respects. I chose the second because it was the only one that ever worked. The house I grew up in still stands in Chesapeake, Virginia, tucked into a quiet neighborhood where people wave from driveways and believe that silence means peace. From the outside, my family looked respectable. My father was known as reliable, opinionated, the kind of man who spoke loudly at community meetings and quietly at home where his rules mattered more than explanations. My mother kept everything polished, floors clean, curtains pressed, smiles practiced. Order mattered in our house, but affection was rationed. My older brother Mark learned early how to earn it. He played the right sports, echoed my father's opinions, laughed at the right jokes. When he walked into a room, my father straightened like approval was automatic. When I did, the air shifted. Not hostile, evaluative, as if I needed to justify the space I occupied. My brother's achievements were celebrated publicly. A new truck meant a backyard barbecue. A promotion meant church announcements and congratulations that lasted weeks. When I enlisted, there was no gathering, no send-off. My father said the military was a fallback for people who lacked ambition. He said it casually like an observation, but it landed with intention. My mother nodded lips tight as if agreement was safer than objection. She never argued with him in front of us. She believed harmony meant compliance. Growing up, there were no bruises from fists, no shouting matches that spilled into the street. The control was quieter. My father decided when meals were eaten what conversations were appropriate, which opinions were acceptable. Disagreement was labeled disrespect. Silence was praised as maturity as long as it came from obedience. My mother enforced these rules softly. She reminded me to lower my voice, to smile more, to stop provoking him by being different. Shame was her currency. If I stood too straight, she said I was showing off. If I spoke too little, she said I was cold. Nothing was ever quite right, but it was never dramatic enough to point to. That made it harder to name. My father favored Mark openly. He spoke about him as if he were the natural extension of his own legacy. When Mark struggled, excuses were made. When I succeeded quietly in school, it was minimized. "You always liked studying alone," my mother would say, as if that explained why no one came to my ceremonies. The military only widened the gap. My father mocked it at family gatherings, calling it performative, unnecessary, dangerous for no reason. He told people I worked for men who mattered more. My mother changed the subject whenever someone asked about my service. Over time, I learned that my accomplishments created discomfort. They did not fit the story my parents told themselves, so they edited me out where they could. Control in our house did not look like violence. It looked like permission. Permission to speak, permission to rest, permission to matter. My father decided what counted as success. My mother ensured his version went unchallenged. She was not cruel in the way people expect cruelty to look. She was efficient. She absorbed tension and redirected it downward. If my father was displeased, it became my responsibility to fix the atmosphere. Apologies were expected even when no wrong had occurred. Gratitude was demanded for basic decency. Love came with conditions that shifted depending on his mood. I learned early that pushing back only made things harder, so I adapted. I stopped asking to be seen. I stopped expecting encouragement. I built my confidence elsewhere in systems that rewarded consistency instead of favoritism. My parents did not notice the distance growing because they never looked closely. To them, my silence meant acceptance. To me, it meant preparation. When I left home at 18, my father told me not to embarrass the family. My mother hugged me lightly and whispered to stay safe, like safety was a favor I could earn by behaving correctly. They did not call during training. They did not ask about my assignments. When Mark visited with stories, the house filled with laughter. When I visited in uniform, the room stiffened. I learned that some families do not cheer because cheering would require admitting they were wrong about you. And some parents would rather preserve their pride than acknowledge a child who chose a different path. By the time I stood in court years later, the lack of support no longer surprised me. It simply clarified something I had always known but never said aloud. They never celebrated me because celebrating me would have meant letting go of control. Tell me in the comments, did your family ever celebrate everyone but you? Control in my family never needed bruises to be effective. It lived in systems and paperwork and conversations held just out of reach. Money was the first lever my father learned to pull quietly. He believed financial dependence was proof of wisdom and independence was a threat. When my grandfather passed the land in Chesapeake became a point of leverage, not legacy. The house sat on acreage that held more memory than value, and my father spoke about it as if it were already his, even though the will named me. He never said it outright. He did not need to. He reminded me how expensive upkeep could be, how taxes added up, how mistakes could cost a family everything. My mother repeated these concerns softly, framing them as care, but the message was clear. You cannot handle this alone. When I began paying the property taxes myself, quietly year after year, my father did not thank me. He told people I was wasting money trying to prove something. He suggested I was reckless, irresponsible, emotionally attached to land I had no right to claim. Financial control also came through access. My parents shared information selectively. They discussed estate plans without me present. They hinted at changes without specifics. My brother Mark was looped in early, consulted, often reassured constantly. I learned about decisions after they were made, usually through implication rather than fact. If I asked questions, my father accused me of mistrust. If I pressed, my mother warned me not to upset him. The message was consistent. Transparency was conditional. Inheritance became a tool to enforce obedience. Not promised, not denied, simply dangled. My father spoke about fairness while practicing favoritism, always reserving the right to redefine what fair meant. Outside the house, the narrative spread differently. In our church community, my parents curated a careful image. They praised Mark openly, framed his choices as family-centered and responsible. When my name came up, the tone shifted. They said I was distant, that the military had changed me, that I was difficult to reach. They never lied directly. They simply omitted context. Silence did the rest. Over time, whispers replaced facts. People began to see me as ungrateful, overly serious someone who chose duty over family. My father encouraged this quietly. He never defended me. He did not need to. Letting assumptions stand served his purpose. My mother nodded sympathetically when others expressed concern about me. She framed my absence as choice rather than boundary, my quiet as judgment rather than survival. Community control works best when it appears organic. No one confronted me directly. They asked questions sideways. "How is your family really doing? You should visit more. Your parents worry." Each comment carried the same implication. I was the problem. I learned that reputation can be shaped without a single accusation. All it takes is consistent framing. In small towns, perception hardens fast. Once the idea of me as the family embarrassment took hold, everything I did was filtered through it. My service became avoidance. My independence became arrogance. My silence became guilt. My father relied on this. He understood that social pressure could accomplish what force never could. When I visited, conversations were staged. Comments slipped in casually. "We hear you are having trouble adjusting. Must be hard after the military. Are you sure you are stable enough to manage property matters?" My mother echoed concern with practiced worry, never correcting the premise. They were not asking, they were positioning. Control without bruises feels confusing because it lacks a clear villain. There are no marks to point to, no moment that forces recognition. Instead, there is erosion, confidence worn down by implication, autonomy questioned by concern, legitimacy undermined by rumor. I watched it happen in real time and still struggled to name it. Because nothing they did looked cruel in isolation. It only became clear when viewed together. Money discussions framed as protection. Inheritance conversations framed as responsibility. Community whispers framed as care. All of it pointed in one direction. Stay small. Stay dependent. Stay quiet. When I refused, the tone shifted. Not angry, strategic. My father began referring to the property as abandoned whenever I was not physically present. He told people I did not care. He said he worried about liability, about neglect. He said these things knowing I paid every bill. My mother expressed sadness that I had pulled away from family obligations. She never mentioned that those obligations were never extended to me. By the time legal language entered the conversation, the groundwork had already been laid. Abandonment, irresponsibility, distance. Each word had been rehearsed socially long before it appeared on paper. When the summons arrived, it did not feel sudden. It felt like the final step in a process that began years earlier when control shifted from household rules to public narrative. I realized then that bruises heal. Reputations once damaged quietly take far longer to repair. And that was exactly the point. 1 week before court, I drove back to Chesapeake to finalize paperwork tied to the property. October. Light filtered through the trees the way it always had, familiar enough to lower my guard, just a fraction. I told myself this was a task, not a visit. Papers, signatures, clarification. I arrived mid-morning. My parents were already home. My father stood at the kitchen counter reviewing mail like a ritual, my mother arranging things that did not need arranging. The house smelled the same, cleaners and old wood and control. I placed the folder on the table and explained why I was there. Calm voice, precise words. I said I needed copies of documents that had been referenced in recent correspondence. Nothing accusatory, nothing emotional. My father did not look up. He asked why I was suddenly interested after years away. The implication landed before the sentence ended. I answered plainly. "I have been maintaining the property and I need the records to match." My mother's hands paused. She glanced at him, then back to the cabinet she was pretending to organize. The tension built quietly. My father said I was mistaken. He said the land was family responsibility and family required presence. He said absence looked like abandonment. I corrected him. Not sharply, just factually. I said I had been paying taxes and insurance for years. He finally turned. His expression was tight offended by contradiction more than content. He said money was not the point. He said loyalty was. My mother spoke then softly, asking me not to escalate things. I had not raised my voice. I had not moved. Escalation in that house meant disagreement. I reached for the folder to open it. That was when he stepped closer. The movement was sudden enough to change the air. He told me to put the papers down. He said I was being dramatic again. I said I would leave once I had what I needed. He reached out and shoved my shoulder, not hard enough to knock me down, but hard enough to make the message clear. Do not challenge me here. The room went very quiet. My mother did not speak. She did not move. She watched the floor. I stood still, feeling my balance shift, more surprised than hurt. I said his name once. He responded with a flat palm across my cheek. Not wild. Controlled. A correction. I remember the sound more than the pain, the way it echoed in the kitchen like punctuation. My mother said nothing. She adjusted the sleeve of her sweater and said we should all calm down. The words landed heavier than the strike. I tasted metal and steadied myself against the counter. My father told me this was exactly why I could not be trusted with responsibility. He said I provoked him. He said I had always been difficult. I did not argue. Something inside me settled. Not fear. Finality. I gathered the folder without the documents I came for. I looked at my mother. She would not meet my eyes. I said I was leaving. My father told me not to come back until I learned respect. I walked out without slamming the door. I drove until the shaking stopped. The bruise bloomed slowly. By the time I reached home, it was already visible. I did not photograph it. I did not call anyone. I cleaned my face and sat in silence longer than necessary. The next day, a police report was filed by a neighbor who heard the commotion. I did not initiate it. I answered questions calmly. Facts only. That report would matter later. At the time, it felt like documentation, not justice. The summons arrived 2 days after. Abandonment. Property dispute. Formal language attempting to sanitize what had happened. I understood then that the incident was not an accident. It was a test. How far could they go without consequence? My answer was simple. I would not argue. I would not retaliate. I would let systems speak. I would show up. If silence ever hurt you more than words, you're not alone. I was in court because my parents decided to turn a story they had been telling quietly for years into a legal claim. The petition arrived by certified mail 3 days after the incident in the kitchen, stamped and formal, written in language that pretended neutrality while carrying intent. Abandonment of family property. Failure of familial duty. Request for transfer of ownership due to neglect. The words were clean, distant, and precise, as if removing emotion made them true. I read the document once, then again, more slowly, tracing each line until the pattern emerged. This was not about land. It was about control. They argued that my absence constituted abandonment, that service elsewhere proved disinterest, that my distance justified intervention. They did not mention the taxes paid each year, the insurance maintained without lapse, the repairs scheduled and completed quietly. They did not mention the checks written from my account or the receipts filed in order. They framed presence as proof and absence as guilt, knowing the court would need evidence to challenge that narrative. They filed in civil court in Norfolk, not family court, because property disputes sound cleaner than domestic conflict. It was strategic. The summons required my appearance within weeks. Failure to appear would allow a default judgment. Compliance was not optional. I understood immediately that this was escalation disguised as procedure. My parents did not call. They did not warn me. They let the paperwork speak, because paperwork carries authority without accountability. I considered hiring an attorney right away. I made calls. The responses were polite and cautious. Some firms declined due to conflicts. Others suggested retainer amounts that felt designed to discourage rather than assist. One attorney asked about the family dynamics and paused too long when I explained. Small communities remember names. I realized quickly that representation would not guarantee clarity, and it might delay it. I had learned in service that when systems are biased by proximity, preparation matters more than advocacy. I decided to proceed alone at first. Not because I believed I did not deserve help, but because I needed to understand exactly what they were claiming before allowing anyone else to speak for me. I began organizing my records, 10 years of tax statements, insurance policies, maintenance invoices, photographs of repairs, emails confirming payments. I built a timeline, dates, amounts, locations. I labeled each file with the same care I once used preparing operational briefings. The narrative they presented depended on omission. My response would be accumulation. Being in court was not about defending my character. It was about correcting a record. I did not feel anger reading the claim. I felt recognition. This was the logical extension of the control I grew up with. When private influence failed, public authority was invoked. When family dynamics could no longer enforce compliance, legal language would attempt it. I knew the risk of standing alone. Courts respect counsel. Judges move efficiently when arguments are filtered, but I also knew the risk of distortion. I did not want my story reduced to sound bites or softened for negotiation. I wanted the facts to stand as they were. I prepared accordingly. I filed my response within the required window. Denial of abandonment, affirmation of responsibility, request for evidentiary review, no accusations, no emotional language, just facts. When the court date was set, the weight of it settled in slowly. This was not a misunderstanding to resolve privately. This was a public examination of a narrative I had lived under for decades. I chose to wear my uniform not as argument but as context. It explained my absence without apology. It explained my discipline without words. I understood how it might be perceived. Some would see it as provocation, others as performance. That did not concern me. What mattered was coherence. My life had been consistent even when unseen. The court would decide whether consistency mattered more than proximity. I did not hire a lawyer before the first appearance because I wanted to hear my parents present their case without interference. I wanted to see how far the narrative would go when placed under oath. I wanted to watch how they spoke when required to choose words carefully. In my experience, pressure reveals patterns. The truth does not need protection. It needs exposure, and court is where exposure becomes record. Preparation did not look dramatic. It looked quiet, repetitive, and methodical, the way real readiness always does. I shifted into what I privately called mission mode, the mental state that engages when emotion becomes a liability and clarity is required. Each morning, I woke before dawn, not from anxiety, but from habit. My body remembered schedules even when my life no longer depended on them. Coffee. Light, stretching for the knee that still complained when weather changed. Breathing slow enough to keep my pulse steady. I spread documents across my dining table in neat rows. Tax records first. Year by year, county stamps clear amounts consistent, no gaps. Then mortgage statements and insurance renewals, each one a quiet proof of responsibility. Maintenance receipts followed. Roof repairs, fence work, plumbing, electrical. Ordinary things that keep a property alive but rarely earn recognition. I scanned everything into digital files, labeled folders precisely, and backed them up twice, once locally, once encrypted. Overkill to some. Necessary to me. I built a timeline that showed continuity without commentary. The goal was not persuasion, it was inevitability. In the military, we learned that panic wastes time. Calm preserves it. I treated the case like a briefing. What is known, what is claimed, what is provable, what is irrelevant. Emotion fell into the last category. I practiced answers aloud, not because I expected to be interrogated, but because clarity improves when words are chosen before pressure arrives. Short sentences, direct responses, no qualifiers. I did not rehearse accusations. I rehearsed facts. Parallel to this, something else moved quietly beneath the surface. The mild PTSD I carried never arrived with chaos or flashbacks. It arrived with vigilance, with the need to control variables, with the occasional tightening in my chest when confronted with raised voices or sudden movements. I acknowledged it without indulging it. Therapy had taught me to recognize patterns without letting them dictate behavior. When my thoughts drifted toward the kitchen incident, I noted the sensation and redirected focus. Evidence does not benefit from rumination. I slept lightly but adequately. When dreams came, they were procedural, not violent. Checklists, missed details. The sensation of being responsible for outcomes beyond control. I wrote notes when I woke, then closed the notebook and returned to the present. Mission mode does not eliminate feeling. It contains it. Friends asked if I was nervous. I said no. They assumed denial. It was not. Nervousness implies uncertainty. I knew exactly what I was walking into. A courtroom is not a battlefield, but both reward composure. I chose clothing for court carefully. The uniform would come later. For preparation days, I wore neutral colors, comfortable shoes, nothing that invited attention. I ate regularly. I hydrated. I limited caffeine. These details matter more than people admit. My parents did not contact me. That silence confirmed strategy. They were preparing their own narrative, confident it would hold. I did not monitor their movements. Intelligence gathering has limits when emotional entanglement exists. I focused inward. Each evening, I reviewed the file once more, not to memorize it, but to internalize its order. Confidence comes from familiarity, not bravado. On the fourth day, I reviewed the police report from the neighbor call. Factual, neutral, time-stamped. It described voices raised in altercation, observed physical contact noted. It did not assign motive. That was ideal. I added it to the file without commentary. I practiced grounding techniques before sleep. Feet on floor, breath counted. Naming objects in the room. These were not signs of weakness, they were maintenance, just like the knee brace I wore on longer walks. I did not tell myself I was fine. I told myself I was prepared. There is a difference. When the court date approached, I felt the familiar narrowing of focus that used to come before operations. Distractions fell away. Noise lost relevance. I stopped reading messages that speculated outcomes. I stopped explaining myself to people who asked questions they could not answer. The night before court, I laid the uniform out carefully, pressed, aligned, not for effect, for order. Order calms the nervous system. As I closed the folder and set it by the door, I felt no surge of adrenaline, just steadiness, the kind that comes when panic has nowhere to land. Whatever happened next would happen in the open. I had done my part. Courtroom day 1 began without ceremony. I arrived early and took my place at the defense table alone. My folder set square in front of me, hands folded loosely as if waiting for instructions that would never come. The room filled slowly. My parents entered together with their attorney, a man in a tailored suit who carried himself like someone used to being deferred to. He greeted them with quiet confidence, leaned in, whispered reassurances. My father nodded as if outcomes were already decided. My mother smoothed her jacket and kept her eyes forward. They did not acknowledge me. That was deliberate. Ignoring me was a way to reduce me to background noise. When the clerk called the case, I stood when instructed and sat when told. Routine steadied me. Across the aisle, my father leaned toward my mother and murmured just loud enough for the space between us to carry it. "She has always been dramatic." The words were familiar. He had used them my entire life to reframe my reactions as excess rather than response. A few heads turned. A few eyebrows lifted. I did not look back. I kept my gaze on the bench. The judge entered and the room rose. He was older, composed, the kind of presence that settles a room without effort. When he took his seat, he scanned the docket, then paused briefly at my name. Not long, just long enough to register. Proceedings began with formalities. The attorney spoke first, outlining the claim in careful language that sounded reasonable if you did not know what was missing. Abandonment, neglect, concern for property, duty to family. He referenced my absence without mentioning its cause. He spoke about continuity without acknowledging who paid for it. He presented my parents as caretakers, stepping in reluctantly. I listened without interruption. When it was my turn to respond, the judge looked at me directly. "Do you have counsel?" I answered, "No, Your Honor." He nodded once. "Very well." He asked me to confirm my name and address. Then his eyes dropped briefly to the file in front of him. He turned a page. Another. His gaze lifted again, different now. "Ms. Mercer," he said, "your service record is noted here. 12 years. Support operations. Medically retired." The room shifted. Not dramatically. Subtly, the attorney hesitated before continuing. My father straightened irritation flickering across his face. My mother glanced at the bench and then away. The judge did not comment further. He asked procedural questions. He clarified timelines. He requested documentation. When he spoke, it was precise. When he listened, it was complete. I answered plainly: dates, payments, locations. I did not embellish. I did not explain motivations. I offered facts. At one point, the attorney attempted to characterize my absence as willful distance. The judge asked for evidence. The attorney referenced to community statements. The judge raised a hand slightly. Hearsay will not suffice. We will focus on records. The balance in the room adjusted again. I could feel it. Not vindication. Alignment. The judge requested copies of tax records. I handed them over calmly. He reviewed the first page, then the second. He glanced at the timeline I provided, year by year, no gaps. He set the documents aside and made a note. My father shifted in his seat. The attorney pivoted, emphasizing emotional estrangement. The judge redirected. This is a civil matter regarding property responsibility. Emotional context is not dispositive. The phrase landed with weight. My father leaned toward his attorney and whispered sharply. The attorney nodded and adjusted strategy. When my mother spoke briefly, she framed concern as care. The judge listened and thanked her, then asked if she had documentation to support claims of neglect. She did not. Silence followed. Not awkward, instructive. Throughout it all, I remained still. Not rigid, composed. The judge asked me once about my injury. I answered that it occurred during a training exercise and resulted in medical limitation. He nodded. No follow-up. He was not interested in spectacle. As the session ended, he set a schedule for evidentiary review. He requested additional documentation from both sides. He reminded everyone that statements made would be under oath. When he adjourned for the day, the room exhaled. My parents stood quickly speaking in tight whispers. Their attorney avoided my gaze. A few people in the gallery looked at me differently than they had earlier. Not with pity, with curiosity edged by reassessment. I gathered my papers slowly. Outside the courtroom, my father's voice rose briefly before cutting off. Control slipping often sounds like impatience. I walked out alone, steady pace, shoulders relaxed. Have you ever been underestimated in public? The second morning in court carried a different weight. I felt it before I entered the building, in the way the air pressed heavier against my chest, in the way conversations stopped when I passed. My parents arrived earlier than usual, their attorney already speaking in low, urgent tones. My father's confidence from the day before had thinned into something sharper. Irritation. Anticipation. Control strained always leaks first through impatience. When the judge entered, he moved with the same calm authority, but his attention settled immediately on the bench file, thicker now with submitted records. He reviewed documents briefly, then looked up and addressed the court. Before we proceed further, he said there is an evidentiary matter that must be addressed. He turned toward my parents' attorney. You referenced a domestic incident in your filings as evidence of instability. The attorney nodded cautiously. Yes, Your Honor. We believe it demonstrates volatility. The judge's expression did not change. Very well. He turned toward me. Ms. Mercer, you submitted supplemental material overnight. I confirmed. Yes, Your Honor. He nodded once. The bailiff was instructed to prepare the display. The screen at the front of the courtroom came to life. A police body cam timestamp appeared. The date was clear, 1 week before the petition was filed. The location listed was my parents' address in Chesapeake. The room stilled. The footage began without sound at first. Grainy but unmistakable. The familiar kitchen. My mother at the counter. Me standing near the table with a folder in hand. My father entering frame abruptly. When audio came through, his voice filled the room sharper than memory, amplified by speakers that removed all doubt. He accused. He advanced. The camera shook slightly as the officer adjusted position, then the shove, then the slap. The sound was flat and final, echoing through the courtroom in a way it never had through walls at home. Someone in the gallery inhaled sharply. The video continued just long enough to show my lack of response. No retaliation. No raised voice. Just me stepping back and saying I was leaving. The judge raised a hand and the footage froze. Silence dropped heavy and absolute. Not the awkward silence of uncertainty, but the silence that follows clarity. My father's face drained of color. My mother stared at the screen, mouth slightly open, hands clenched in her lap. Their attorney did not speak. He could not. The judge removed his glasses slowly and set them on the bench. He leaned forward. "This court will not entertain character arguments unsupported by fact," he said evenly. He looked directly at my parents. "This footage contradicts the narrative presented." My father attempted to speak, voice rising. "That video is misleading. She provoked me." The judge raised his hand again, firmer this time. "Sir, you will not speak out of turn." He turned back to the screen and reviewed the police report summary. Voices raised, physical contact observed, no indication of provocation by the respondent. He looked up. The courtroom had shifted fully now. The judge's tone changed, not louder, but sharper. Focused. "Ms. Mercer," he said, "did you initiate this recording?" "No, Your Honor. A neighbor contacted law enforcement after hearing the altercation." The officer's body cam captured the interaction. The judge nodded. He turned to my parents' attorney. "You submitted this incident as evidence of instability." He paused. "Do you still wish to characterize it that way?" The attorney cleared his throat. "Your Honor, in light of the footage, we would like to clarify our position." The judge did not allow it. "Clarification will come later." He looked back at me. "Ms. Mercer, did you seek medical attention?" "No, Your Honor." "Did you file a complaint?" "No, Your Honor." The judge's jaw tightened slightly. "Restraint is noted." He turned to my parents again. Control evaporated from the room. My father's posture collapsed inward, anger replaced by something close to panic. My mother's eyes flicked from the judge to the gallery, realizing too late that this was no longer a private family matter framed by their version of events. This court does not take lightly the misuse of domestic incidents to gain advantage in civil proceedings, the judge said. His voice was steady, but unmistakably firm. Nor does it ignore evidence of physical aggression when presented under oath. He addressed the gallery briefly. "The court will recess for 15 minutes. When we return, we will proceed under a revised evidenti framework." The gavel struck once. As the room erupted into low murmurs, my parents remained seated, frozen. Their attorney leaned in, whispering urgently. My father shook his head, denial fighting gravity. I sat still. I did not look at them. I did not need to. The exposure was complete. Years of quiet control undone in less than 2 minutes of unfiltered truth. When the judge returned, the authority dynamic had permanently shifted. They had lost the narrative, and with it, the only weapon they ever relied on. When the court reconvened, the room felt smaller, as if truth had taken up space and left no room for performance. The judge returned to the bench and did not shuffle papers or clear his throat. He looked directly at me. First, not at my parents, not at their attorney. "Ms. Mercer," he said, his voice measured and clear. "Please stand." I rose. He glanced at the record again, then addressed me with deliberate precision. "Petty Officer Mercer, formerly assigned to Naval Special Warfare Support Operations, 12 years of service, medically retired." He paused. The words landed with weight. He had chosen accuracy over convenience. He continued. "Your service record reflects continuous duty during the period in question. Your financial records reflect continuous responsibility for the property at issue." He turned a page. "The claim before this court asserts abandonment." He looked up. "That assertion is not supported by the evidence." My father shifted the bench, creaking beneath him. The judge did not acknowledge it. He spoke slowly now, not for effect, but for clarity. "Abandonment requires neglect, failure of duty, or intent to relinquish responsibility." He gestured lightly to the documents. "The record shows the opposite. Taxes paid annually without lapse, insurance maintained, repairs completed, communication documented." He set his hand flat on the bench. "Service is not abandonment." The sentence cut clean through the room. It was not raised. It was not dramatic. It was definitive. A murmur moved through the gallery before settling again. The judge turned to my parents' attorney. "You have framed absence as evidence. The court recognizes lawful service as obligation, not neglect." He turned back to me. "Ms. Mercer, Your absence from the property coincided with active duty assignments and medical recovery. Both are legitimate. He looked to my parents. This court will not penalize a respondent for fulfilling service obligations. My mother's hands tightened together. My father's jaw worked as if chewing words he could not say. The judge continued now, addressing the misuse of narrative. The court also notes the attempt to characterize a documented incident of physical aggression as evidence of instability on the part of the respondent. He paused, allowing the weight to settle. That characterization is rejected. He referenced the footage again briefly clinically. The respondent disengaged. The respondent did not retaliate. The respondent sought no advantage from the incident. That restraint speaks to credibility. He leaned back slightly. Credibility matters here. He looked at my parents' filings, then back at them. The court finds a pattern of selective disclosure in the petition, omission of financial contributions, emphasis on proximity over responsibility. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Authority was doing the work. He addressed me again. Ms. Mercer, do you wish to make a statement? I considered it. I shook my head once. No, Your Honor. He nodded. Wise. He addressed the courtroom at large. Justice is not served by volume. It is served by evidence. He reviewed the remaining points efficiently. Property ownership affirmed. Claims of abandonment denied. He indicated that the matter of the domestic incident would be addressed separately. He did not look at my parents when he said it. He did not need to. The message had already arrived. When he concluded, the room felt steadier, like a structure that had been tested and held. People did not rush to stand. They sat with it. I felt something loosen in my chest, not relief but recognition. This was not about being believed emotionally. It was about being seen accurately. As the judge prepared to adjourn, he looked at me one final time. Ms. Mercer, the court acknowledges your service and your restraint. Thank you. The words were not praise. They were acknowledgement. I nodded once. Outside, conversations buzzed, but inside me there was quiet. If truth ever spoke for you when you stayed silent, leave A. Verdict day arrived without drama, which felt fitting. There were no raised voices, no final speeches, no cinematic pause. The judge entered, reviewed the final document submitted overnight, and began reading findings into the record with the same steady cadence he had maintained throughout. His words were precise and unemotional, but the meaning carried weight. The court found in my favor on every substantive claim. Ownership of the property was affirmed, responsibility established, the allegation of abandonment formally denied and entered as unsupported. The judge ordered a protective order limited in scope but firm in boundary. No direct contact except through legal counsel. No interference with property access. No public misrepresentation related to the matter. The violation of that order would carry immediate consequence. My parents were also assessed court costs and penalties related to filing a claim lacking evidentiary basis. The judge made clear this was not punitive for its own sake. It was corrective. Legal systems exist to resolve disputes, not to extend private control through public authority. He looked directly at my father when he said it. The sentence was delivered calmly, but the implication landed hard. My father stared straight ahead, face set as if refusing to register loss would undo it. My mother's shoulders sagged slightly, the first visible crack in the composure she had maintained for years. Their attorney gathered papers quickly, already shifting into damage control. When the judge finished, he asked if there were any questions regarding the order. There were none. He struck the gavel once. Court adjourned. That was it. No applause. No release. Just resolution entered into record. I remained seated for a moment after everyone stood, letting the room empty around me. Winning did not feel like triumph. It felt like alignment, like something long misnamed had finally been called what it was. Outside the courtroom, reporters were absent. There was no spectacle waiting. A few people from this gallery glanced at me with something like respect, then looked away, embarrassed by having once believed a quieter lie. My parents exited quickly, surrounded by silence instead of affirmation. No one followed them. No one asked questions. Control without witnesses evaporates fast. I walked out alone. The air outside felt cooler than expected. I did not smile. I did not cry. I did not call anyone. Celebration would have implied that something joyful had occurred. What happened was necessary, not joyful. I drove home without music hands, steady on the wheel, mind clear. The protective order sat folded in my bag, not as a trophy, but as a boundary recognized by law. At a stoplight, I noticed my reflection in the mirror. The bruise had faded almost completely. Time had done what no argument could. That felt appropriate, too. Over the following days, the consequences settled in quietly. Notices were posted, records updated. The community narrative shifted without announcement. People who once whispered avoided eye contact. Others nodded politely. No one apologized. I did not expect them to. Justice does not require acknowledgement from everyone who misunderstood you. My parents did not reach out. They could not. The order prevented it. That silence was different from the ones before. It was enforced. It was clean. It allowed space where pressure once lived. I returned to routine. Work on the house continued. Bills paid. Repairs scheduled. Life resumed at the pace I chose. There was no urge to check in on my parents, no satisfaction in imagining their discomfort. Detachment replaced vigilance. That was the real outcome. When people asked how court went, I said it was resolved, nothing more. I did not recount details. I did not perform vindication. I let the record stand on its own. At night, sleep came easier. Not perfect, but unguarded. The system had done what it was designed to do when evidence was allowed to speak. I did not celebrate because celebration would have tethered me to the past longer than necessary. Winning was not the point. Freedom was. The town did not turn loudly. It turned the way small places always do, quietly and all at once, as if everyone agreed without ever speaking about it. On Sunday morning, I attended church for the first time in months. Not out of obligation, out of curiosity. I wanted to see what truth looked like once it left the courtroom and entered familiar pews. The sanctuary smelled the same polished wood and old hymnals, but the atmosphere had shifted. People noticed me immediately. Not with the strained smiles they used before, not with the careful distance reserved for embarrassment. Heads turned, conversations paused, a few people nodded. One woman touched my arm lightly and said she was glad to see me. She did not explain why. She did not need to. During the service, the pastor spoke about accountability without naming anyone. His words were measured, almost cautious, but the message was unmistakable. Afterward, the fellowship hall buzzed in a different register. Questions were not asked directly. Statements were made instead. I heard fragments as I passed. I did not realize she handled all that. I thought she just stayed away. That must have been hard. The narrative had shifted from suspicion to reassessment. No announcement triggered it. Records did. Court filings circulate faster than gossip when people are curious enough. My parents did not attend church that morning, or the next, or the one after that. Absence that once defined me now defined them. Neighbors who used to wave enthusiastically from across the street became reserved when passing their house. Some avoided it entirely. Others slowed just enough to look. Rumors reversed direction with remarkable speed. The same people who once repeated concerns about my distance now questioned my parents' behavior. Control depends on consensus. When consensus breaks, isolation follows. A woman who lived 2 houses down stopped me one afternoon as I was checking the mailbox. She apologized without qualifiers. She said she wished she had asked more questions earlier. I thanked her and moved on. Apologies were not necessary. Awareness was enough. The grocery store felt different too. I noticed how often people had known my name without knowing me. Now they knew context. They knew facts. They did not need my version. The court had provided it. My parents' house grew quieter, lights off earlier, curtains drawn. The social buffer they relied on had dissolved. Friends who once defended them with confidence now hesitated. Invitations slowed. Phone calls stopped. The same mechanisms they used to isolate me worked in reverse when evidence removed ambiguity. I did not watch this with satisfaction. I observed it like weather, patterns repeating under different conditions. My brother Mark called once. His voice was strained. He asked what really happened. I told him he could read the filings. He did not push. He did not apologize. He ended the call quickly. Even he sensed that the hierarchy he benefited from had collapsed. Control without witnesses cannot survive transparency. My parents did not confront me. They could not. The protective order ensured distance. Their silence was not repentance. It was adaptation. I continued working on the house visible now in a way I never had been before. Contractors greeted me by name. Neighbors asked how long I planned to stay. Their tone assumed legitimacy rather than intrusion. Small shifts matter. They accumulate into belonging. At church, my seat no longer felt provisional. People spoke to me without lowering their voices. No one asked me to explain myself. That was the clearest sign of change. When rumors turn, they do not ask permission. They seek equilibrium. My parents' isolation was not announced. It emerged naturally as people recalibrated their trust. No one enjoys realizing they misjudged someone. Distance protects pride. I understood that instinct well. I left them to it. The town did not crown me right. It simply stopped assuming I was wrong. That was enough. In small places, reputation is currency. Mine had been spent without my consent for years. The court returned it with interest, not through praise, but through quiet correction. As autumn deepened, the streets grew calmer. Leaves fell. Routine resumed. My parents' house remained still. Mine filled with movement. That contrast was not accidental. It was consequence. They came back when they needed something. Not immediately, not while the town was still watching, but months later when attention had moved on and silence felt safer again. The protective order allowed indirect contact through counsel, and that was how it began. A letter forwarded by an attorney, carefully worded, stripped of tone, heavy with implication. My father's health had declined. A cardiac issue newly diagnosed, serious enough to require monitoring. My mother was struggling to manage care. Finances were tight. Medical bills had accumulated faster than expected. The letter did not apologize. It did not acknowledge harm. It framed the situation as unfortunate timing, as if circumstances alone were responsible. The request followed quietly. Assistance, temporary support, family obligation. I read it once and set it aside. 2 weeks later, another letter arrived. This one referenced shared history, sacrifice, the difficulty of aging. My mother's handwriting appeared briefly at the bottom, a single line added in pen. We need help. The audacity was not that they asked. It was that they asked as if nothing had changed, as if control could be resumed simply because vulnerability had shifted direction. I did not respond immediately. I sat with the request the way I had learned to sit with pressure. Calmly, without urgency. I consulted no one. This was not a legal decision. It was a boundary decision. Memories surfaced uninvited. The kitchen. The silence afterward. Years of control disguised as care. I noticed my body's reaction. No spike in anxiety. No urge to justify. Just a tightening that signaled recognition. This was familiar terrain. Need had always been their leverage. I drafted a response and rewrote it twice, each version shorter than the last. When I sent it, it was brief. I acknowledged receipt. I expressed hope that appropriate medical care was being arranged. I stated clearly that I would not provide financial support or personal caregiving. I cited the existing order and requested that future communication remain limited to legal matters. I did not explain why. Explanations invite negotiation. Silence afterward was immediate. Then came the escalation. My brother called again, voice urgent now. He said they were scared. He said family should step in. He said people were talking. I listened. I said nothing until he finished. Then I told him that stepping in was a choice, not an obligation. I told him I had already made mine. He accused me of being cold. I told him coldness was learned. He hung up. A week later, my mother appeared at the edge of my property, standing near the gate, not crossing it. She looked smaller, older. Illness does that quickly. She did not call out. She waited. I stepped outside but did not approach. The distance was deliberate. She said my name softly. She said she did not know what else to do. She said she was tired. She said she needed help. I asked if she had read my letter. She nodded. She said she hoped I would change my mind. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse. I told her no. I told her I had built a life that required peace to function. I told her I would not trade that peace for obligation enforced by guilt. She began to cry, not loudly, controlled, familiar. I did not move. I told her I wished her well. I asked her to leave. She stood there for a moment longer, then turned and walked away. Watching her go was not satisfying. It was clarifying. The consequence of control is isolation when power shifts. Forgiveness without accountability restores the original imbalance. I understood that instinctively now. Weeks passed. I heard through others that my father's condition stabilized, that finances were adjusted, that resources were found elsewhere. Crisis had been a catalyst, not a sentence. They adapted. They always had. The request had not been about survival. It had been about reestablishing access. I protected my peace because peace had been earned the hard way. Would you forgive or protect your peace? Saying no did not come with raised voices or shaking hands. It came the way most final decisions do, quietly and without ceremony. By the time they returned, asking again, the answer was already settled inside me. I had lived with uncertainty long enough to recognize when something was complete. My parents' attempts did not surprise me. They followed the same pattern I had known since childhood. Pressure softened into appeal. Appeal shifted into urgency. Urgency tried to become obligation. Each step assumed I would bend because I always had before. This time I did not. There was no anger fueling the refusal. Anger would have tethered me to them. I wanted distance, not victory. When my brother called a third time, his voice edged with frustration. I let him speak without interruption. He listed reasons. He named expectations. He framed my refusal as punishment. I listened and then answered evenly. I am not punishing anyone. I am choosing myself. He asked how I could live with it. I told him I already had. Silence followed. He did not argue. He could not find leverage where none existed. The clarity surprised him. It surprised me too. In the days that followed, messages arrived through intermediaries, suggestions of compromise, short visits, temporary help. Each offer assumed negotiation. Each assumed access. I declined without elaboration. No is a complete sentence when you allow it to be. The most difficult moment came when my mother sent a final message through counsel requesting a meeting to explain herself. Explanation had always been her refuge. Context without accountability. I considered it carefully. Then I declined. Meeting would have reopened a dynamic that relied on emotional labor I no longer owed. Closure does not require conversation when patterns are already understood. Weeks later, I ran into an old family friend at the hardware store. He asked gently how my parents were doing. I told him I hoped they were well. He waited, expecting more. I did not offer it. He nodded, understanding more than he said. People often recognize boundaries when they see them held consistently. At home, the quiet felt earned. Mornings were calm. Work progressed steadily. I noticed how much energy had once been spent anticipating reactions that would never change. That energy returned to me now available for living. When memories surfaced, they no longer carried charge. They were facts, not wounds. The phrase formed in my mind one evening as I locked the door and turned off the lights. Simple, accurate, unemotional. You taught me to survive alone. I did. It was not an accusation. It was acknowledgement. Survival had been my training long before the military ever was. They had taught me resilience by withholding support. They had taught me self-reliance by making dependence unsafe. I did not owe them repayment for lessons learned under pressure. Those lessons had already been paid for in full. The cold no was not cold because it lacked feeling. It was cold because it lacked negotiation. It did not seek understanding. It did not ask permission. It stood firm because it was grounded in truth rather than reaction. Over time, the requests stopped. Not because they understood, but because persistence no longer yielded results. I heard later that my parents adjusted their plans, different caregivers, different arrangements. Life moved forward for them as it does for everyone. I did not track the details. My role in their story had ended. In its place, my own life expanded, I planned without factoring in obligation. I made decisions without bracing for backlash. Peace became routine rather than rare. That was the real consequence of the cold no. Not punishment, freedom. Peace did not arrive all at once. It arrived in small, practical choices that added up to something stable. I began with the house because it was tangible and honest. Walls respond to effort. Wood tells you when it is weak. Systems either work or they do not. There is comfort in that kind of clarity. I replaced what needed replacing and repaired what could be saved. Floors first, then wiring, then the slow cosmetic details that make a space feel lived in rather than defended. I worked with my hands more than I ever had before. Measuring, sanding, painting. The rhythm settled me. Work became a form of healing not because it distracted me, but because it required presence. You cannot think about old arguments while aligning a door frame. You cannot replay conversations while calculating load limits. Each task pulled me forward into the moment. I started taking better care of my body too, not out of discipline, but out of respect. Physical therapy for my knee became less about rehabilitation and more about maintenance. I cooked real meals. I slept with windows cracked open. I noticed how much of my military routine had been survival-oriented. Eat fast, rest lightly, stay ready. Those habits loosened slowly. I did not abandon them. I adapted them. Mornings still came early, but they were no longer rushed. Coffee was not fuel. It was pleasure. I spent weekends working without urgency stopping when my body said enough. That was new. For years, I had worn my SEAL identity like armor, not in arrogance but in protection. It justified distance. It explained silence. It kept questions at bay. Over time, I realized I no longer needed it that way. The uniform folded in the closet did not lose meaning. It changed function. It became a memory of capability rather than a shield against intrusion. I was still disciplined, still precise, still calm under pressure. Those traits did not belong to the military alone. They belonged to me. I volunteered quietly with a local veterans support group, not in leadership, not as a spokesperson. I helped with logistics, transportation, scheduling, background work, familiar roles. No one asked for my story. That felt right. Healing does not require being witnessed. It requires being allowed. The house began to reflect that shift. It filled with light, with space, with the absence of tension. Friends visited without bracing. Conversations moved easily. I laughed more than I expected to, not loudly, freely, the kind of laughter that does not look over its shoulder afterward. I stopped checking my phone for messages that never came. I stopped anticipating confrontation. The hypervigilance softened, not disappeared, softened. I could sit in silence without scanning for threat. I could rest without earning it. That was the deepest change. One evening I stood on the porch as the sun set over the trees. The air smelled like cut grass and distant rain. I realized I was not waiting for anything. No call, no apology, no resolution. The war was over because I had stopped fighting, not in defeat, in completion. My parents existed somewhere beyond my perimeter now. Not enemies, not responsibilities, just people whose choices no longer defined my range of motion. That distance was not cold, it was clear. I kept moving forward. Projects finished, new ones began. Life expanded in quiet ways that do not make headlines but make days easier to live. The military had taught me how to endure. Peace taught me how to remain. I was no longer armored. I was grounded. I stood on the front porch just after sunrise, the hour when the air is still undecided about the day. The house behind me was quiet in the way only safe places are quiet. Not tense, not waiting, just settled. The wood beneath my feet was newly sealed warm already from the early light. I rested my hands on the railing and looked out over the yard, the trees framing the property the way they always had, unchanged by court orders or family histories. This was mine, not as a prize, as a place where nothing pulled at me anymore. I did not look back. There was nothing behind me that required attention, no door to guard, no argument to prepare for, no apology to anticipate. For a long time, I thought justice would arrive as a moment, a confrontation, a recognition so obvious it would rewrite the past. That belief kept me braced alert waiting. What I learned instead was quieter and far more durable. Justice does not announce itself. It settles. It removes pressure. It leaves you standing without weight on your shoulders. Revenge would have required energy. It would have kept me tied to people who thrived on reaction. Justice required only boundaries and time. I did not need to be heard by everyone. I needed to be free from explaining myself. That freedom arrived gradually, then, all at once, the day I realized I no longer rehearsed conversations in my head. I no longer planned responses to questions that might come. My mind had space again. I filled it with living. I planted a small garden near the back fence, more for rhythm than yield. Watering in the evenings became a marker of time passing gently. I repaired things as they broke instead of letting them accumulate. I invited people over without worrying about who might disapprove. The absence of tension was the loudest change. There was no ceremony marking it, just the steady realization that my life no longer revolved around managing someone else's expectations. I did not wait for my parents to understand. Understanding was never the currency they offered. Control was. When control failed, they tried need. When need failed, they tried guilt. When that failed too, they stopped trying. That was not closure in the way stories promise. It was something better. It was finality without drama. Standing free means you accept that some people will never see you clearly and you build anyway. It means you stop hoping that truth will soften those who benefit from distortion. It means you trust evidence over emotion, consistency over performance, and peace over approval. The military taught me how to operate under pressure. Life after taught me how to release it. My uniform hangs in the closet now, cleaned and folded. It carries memory, not identity. When I see it, I do not feel armored. I feel grateful. It reminds me that I am capable of structure and restraint, that I can move through difficult systems without losing myself. It no longer defines me because it does not need to. I defined myself the day I stopped asking permission to exist on my own terms. The town settled back into routine. New stories replaced old ones. That is how it should be. I was not meant to be a lesson for anyone else. I was meant to be a person with a life that made sense to her. Some mornings I sit on the porch longer than necessary, listening to the ordinary sounds of a place that holds no threat. Birds arguing over nothing. A distant lawnmower. Wind moving through leaves. None of it asks anything from me. That is justice, not punishment, not humiliation. Release. I did not win because they lost. I won because I walked away intact. Quiet victory does not shout. It does not prove. It stands and lets the world adjust around it. If this story reminded you that dignity does not shout, share it with someone who needs that reminder.